Well, I look forward to meeting her whenever she.
Huh?
I look forward to meeting her. So
Don't worry about that.
What was the change?
you get to sit while I get to stand while he introduces. I don't need to sit down.
Seveda poseben pozdrav velja našemu stalnemu gostujočemu profesorju, več kot 10 let, predava na fakulteti ali pa v Piranu, pravzaprav začel na piranskih dnevih. Tako da tukaj danes mislim, da je tretjič pri nas. So, Robert, warm welcome to you. I'll just say hello. So maybe I should speak because hello to you. So very warm welcome. It's not the first time that you are here. So you're our good, let's say, friend, more than 10 years coming to Slovenia, so lecturing at the faculty, but as well,
Piran.
you started in Piran,
Yeah.
where of course our students and we staff goes there, and we've been present to your first lecture here. So you are one of the, let's say, visiting professors at our faculty who continuously coming back and forth. So it's a great pleasure to have you here. It's a great pleasure to be the first, how to say, from our side, we are really honored that you are the first guest professor, foreign professor, to address these first days of the new semester of a new academic year. And it's really a big honor, so I wish you say maybe a few words to the students, you know, give a kind of recommendation for that coming semester, hard stuff. So it's a good luck that you are with your school, as I understood, teaching in Florence. You have courses in Florence and Venice and so on, in Italy. So it's from St. Louis, and it's really easier, and it's also today, when you see it's more sustainable, let's say, visiting. So you're just traveling from Venice, or from Florence, not really from United States. And all of your lectures, as you remember, been fully warmly welcomed. Students not only speak about the lecture, but they do read your books. From the first year, with colleague Marusha, we just a week ago, Marusha introduced the literature that, let's say, 10 books the first year students in first semester had to read. So one of the book is from you, not that one, but thicker one. So I hope that we will keep and we continue this, let's say, visiting professorship also in the next years. So I really believe that we'll also do a kind of master class in maybe next year. Or we'll have to talk tomorrow. You're still here, so you're welcome to meet Professor Robert McCarter at the faculty or around the faculty. So anyway, also there will be open question debate after your lecture, and yeah, I do believe everybody will enjoy, as we did up to now, all of your visit, all of your times having been here. So now I invite our colleague Paul Robinson to do introduction.
A very brief introduction.
So once more, thank you for coming.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Don't you hate it, actually, when someone gives an introduction before a lecture, and it's kind of a quasi-lecture in itself, and it lasts way too long? I'm not going to do that today, but I'm going to talk about 3 different things very briefly. But I'm also required to read Professor McCarter's biography.
Wow.
That will take quite a long time, so I'm going to try.
I don't think that's a good idea.
And this is rather dry. But Professor McCarter is an author, a writer, as you know, of architecture and other things. He is a practicing architect and also a professor at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. The kind of hierarchy of how those things operate and affect each other, I think, are non-linear, because most of the things that Professor McCarter does affects each other. How he teaches, how he writes, and how he practices architecture. So there's no real order to that. It depends on the time and the space of which they occur. But he's also taught at the University of Florida, Columbia University, and at 5 other institutions. Also, he has books, 24 of them in fact, to date, that include a new edition of the Lewis Kahn book that he did, I believe in 2005. Other books called Place Matters, The Architecture of W.G. Clark, Grafton Architects, Marcel Breuer, The Space Within, which is what we'll be talking about tonight, Interior Experience as the Origin of Architecture, Stephen Hall, Aldo van Eyck, Herman Hershberger, Alvar Aalto, Carlos Scarpa, Understanding Architecture, which is a primer on architecture as experience with Johannes Elasma, and the earlier Lewis Kahn book along with Frank Lloyd Wright. Robert has exhibited work and literature in the Biennale in Venezia, and he was named one of the 10 best architecture teachers in the United States. Okay, so that's it. It could go on for quite a while, but I think that you understand that Professor McCarter's life is architecture. Okay, this is a passion. I'm going to write 3 words up here, which I think partly this lecture is about, because I think titles explore an awful lot of things about the books that we read and the things that we think about. So, excuse me for using drawing here, but I'm going to write these words. Okay, these are 3 architectural words, right? Anterior, interior, and posterior, meaning what comes before, what is in the middle, and what is behind. Okay, so post, like post-cause, by something that comes after. So anterior coming before, and anti-space, okay? An interior space, and a posterior space, spaces that come after or behind. So this sets up a hierarchy of understanding certain architectural sequences, right? Right, and so here, though, is what we want to concentrate on, is the notion of interior space. Okay, so interior, okay, we're going to say we're inside a space. Okay, secondly, we're going to say that we can be in and we can be with. Okay, so here we have the word coming within. And this is the word that we're concerned about tonight. Okay, so to be within is different to be in or inside. Because if I'm here, if I am in the presence of you and experiencing you, I am with you. Okay, so to be within is more than to be inside. Okay, so to be within also suggests something. It suggests that the space or the condition or the people I am with is more intimate than it is not. Okay, so to be inside is a matter of fact. I am inside this room. To be within this room means I am with the space. And this is a fundamental difference between inside and being within. So the conscious effort of putting this us, it's more of a spiritual condition that we're affected by when we're in architectural space. Okay, so this is something that you cannot do through an image or architecture as an object. Okay, architecture is of course an object, an objectified material condition. But more than that, it is something to experience. And I hope and I think that Professor McCarter is going to talk about the differences between visual space and experience space. The idea of the image and those things that we experience and we hold within and we take with us. Very important. So with that, I'm going to give you Professor Robert McCarter.
Oh. Thank you, sir. Well, thank you, Paul. And someone let me know if the mic is not working properly. and thank you to the faculty for the invitation. This is the third time I've lectured in this room, so I'm beginning to grow fond of this space and the sort of stack of people that I can see everyone from front, which is not the norm in many lecture halls. So after that lesson, I'm going to give maybe what will seem a little bit more of a dry lesson. I want to give a synopsis of this book. When I agreed to publish the book, my contract said that the book would be unillustrated because part of the argument of the book is that photographs in particular do not capture interior space and shouldn't be used as a sort of primary way of learning about interior space. And of course, you know, publishers, they don't think that's such a great idea. So the compromise we came to was that I would put a series of my sketches, which if you have seen the book, you know. But the sketches are not really illustrating the points in the book. They are just showing a different way of apprehending the interior space and the details, a slower way. You can make 100 photographs in the time it takes to make a careful sketch. I would argue the sketch is more important because you will remember the sketch. You won't remember the photographs. So this is a very well illustrated lecture though, so I don't want to mislead you. And it is structured like the book, and I'm going to give some sort of the primary examples as best I can in a kind of truncated way. So the first portion of the book is dealing with the sort of basic idea of the primacy of interior experience in architecture. Throughout human history, interior space and its experience has served as both the beginning, the initial inspiration for the design of architecture, as well as the end, the final purpose of architecture as it is evaluated through inhabitation. Since the beginning of the modern period and continuing today, pivotal discoveries in architectural design may be traced back to a generative ideal of intimate interior experience, and the quality of the internal or interior spatial experience of the inhabitants may be shown to be both the primary determinant of the architectural design process, as well as the means of appropriately evaluating a work of architecture once it's built. The first chapter is the space within as the origin of architecture. Since the beginning of architecture, spatially innovative rooms have emerged earlier in the design process and are more powerful in their experiential impact than the exteriors that are eventually deemed appropriate to clothe them. Among ancient examples, the greatest interior space-making culture, I would argue, remains the Romans, as is epitomized by the Pantheon in Rome, where the massive 20-foot thick wall, like a shell or a mold, shapes the spherical volume of the interior space, which is anchored to the heavens by the central oculus marking the axis mundi, and to the earth by the convex floor forming what the Romans called the navel of the world. This greatest of rooms makes present the ancient Romans' cosmological conception of the world as an interior space and the life of mankind that takes place within that interior space. In the modern period, the conception for a work of architecture has often, the conception of this work of architecture has most often originated in what Frank Lloyd Wright called the space within, so the title is his. And he believed that interior space, and not exterior form, was intractably bound up with the direct experience and presence. Wright said that the architect's principal task was to build the room, the simple room. And he argued that the interior space invariably takes shape prior to the exterior form. This is right. The interior space is the reality of the building. The room itself must come through, or architecture has not arrived. Architecture not alone as form following function, but conceived as space enclosed. The enclosed space itself seen as the reality of the building. The building now became a creation of interior space in light. This sense of the within, the room itself, I see as the great thing to be realized. In 1892, Wright designed the MacArthur House in Chicago, which there's the plan that's a little bit illegible on the lower right and the photograph of the exterior. You can see that it took the form of typical houses along that street. But inside in the plan is an open room an open plan that is connected past the two sides of a fireplace, exactly as he would do in the Roby house in 1908, so 16 years later. And to show that it's not a coincidence, next door is the Blossom House, also 1892 in Chicago, which has a cruciform in a square and one of the first re-entrant corners, the corner folding in and out, that he would use in his Unity Temple in 1906. Both of those projects, you can see that the exterior is in a kind of a normative mode, while the interior is beginning to explore these new ways of shaping space. The primacy of interior space in this experience is also the foundation of the work of Le Corbusier, who shared with Wright an admiration of the precision with which vessels, such as bottles, served as an analogy for the space-containing and experience-defining qualities of architecture. In his Unité Habitation Apartments of Marseille of 1946, Le Corbusier made a drawing, upper left, of prototypical dwellings, and these are his captions, quote, "A hut of a savage, B, the temple of a nomad, C, a bottle, and C, the other bottle, which is an apartment at Marseille," end quote. The apartments as bottles are independent of the skeletal structural frame of the building, or at least that's how he hoped they would be, and Le Corbusier calls the apartments bottles, and the building itself as a bottle rack, into which the apartment bottles are to be placed. The Dominican Monastery of La Troette of 1959, the space of inhabitation within architecture as being analogous to a hollow vessel. This is Corbusier. Architecture is a vase. My reward for 8 years of labor on La Tourette is to have seen the highest things grow and develop within that vase. The monastery does not speak of itself. It lives on its interior. It is in the interior that the essential occurs, end quote. And at the Chapel of Ronchamp in 1950, Le Corbusier described the building as a shell enclosing the space of worship, and the study models of the design's curving walls, lower right, and roof were made of paper on a wire frame, which glowed with the inner light like a lantern, while the final building was made of massive rubble-filled walls and a concrete roof. Le Corbusier felt that the lantern-like models best presented the interior space. The Phillips Pavilion at the Universal Exposition in Brussels, 1958. On the left is an interior space designed for experiencing the poème électronique. It's actually an acoustical space more than a visual space. He described the pavilion on the left, Corbusier, described it as a bottle. The exterior will be made only with scaffolding. The raison d'etre is the interior, end quote. Among the second generation of modern architects, Louis Kahn is most notable for focusing his work on the space within and our inhabitation of it. Kahn saw the interior as generative, saying the room is the beginning of architecture. And he believed that a room must reveal to those who inhabit it how it was built, and he held that the architect should design spaces that were so appropriate to their intended occupation that inhabitants could intuit their use. Rooms must suggest their use without name, end quote. Stephen Hall begins his designs with an initiatory watercolor sketches, which most often present the spaces seen from within, from the point of view of the inhabitant, with little or no indication of exterior form. This is Hall. Once you've got a concept and a strategy, you work your way from the main interior spaces out to the building, because the inside is always more important than the outside, end quote. Todd Williams and Billy Chen begin their design process with a conception about the room, the interior space of inhabitation. This is Williams and Chen. The idea comes from the interior. We live our lives in the interior. The exterior is less and less important as we grow older, end quote. And a second quote, what is important is what lasts, in the memory, if not in actuality. What lasts is space and light. What lasts is ambiguity and the slow revelation of materiality. Finally, what lasts is the interior space. Architectural historian whose writings were strongly influenced by his close relationships and friendship with the painter Ben Nicholson and the sculptor Barbara Hepworth, modern artists who employed low-relief carving in their works. Stokes distinguished two ways of making in his writings: the additive process of modeling, as he called it, which is focused on preconceived exterior form that's perceived almost exclusively through vision. And the materials preferred in modeling are plastic and have little character of their own and can be shaped and are capable of being easily formed in any shape desired. He contrasts this with the subtractive process of carving, which is focused on interior space discovered or disclosed in the process of making, that is perceived by all the senses working in unison, and the solid and resistant nature of the carved materials is directly experienced in the largely tactile way that, as he says, we are compelled to feel our way into the spaces. For Stokes, the making of architecture is predominantly an action involving carving and embodying inhabitation. And he noted, photographs transmit plastic values exceedingly well, carving values hardly at all. The nearness of interior experience and the distance of exterior form. In order to make evident the continued primacy of an interior experience in architecture today, it is necessary to counter our contemporary cultural and social obsession with exterior views and external forms in the representation of architecture, among other things. This has led to our experiencing the building solely as a freestanding object of aesthetic speculation, detached from its place in every way through its being disengaged from the particularities of the landform, the mood of the climate, and the qualities of local culture, social and building traditions. In parallel, it's also important to highlight the way that our focus on the exterior form invariably leads to our near total blindness to interior experience. In evaluating and knowing architecture, photographs of exterior forms are quite literally seen as the only reality. People know buildings through their photographs of the exterior, as reflected in the almost exclusive attention given to building exteriors by architectural historians, critics, educators, and the profession itself. Of greater importance is the way this obsession with the visual representation of exterior forms of architecture dominates all types of media that shape the general public's perception of architecture and the play to represent architecture as seen, always as seen from the exterior. This is the Larkin Building, Buffalo of 1904. Wright argued that a building must be evaluated. This is in response to a criticism of the Buffalo building written by a critic who did not visit the building but only looked at photographs. Wright argued that a building must be evaluated by its interior experience, and the exterior, as an expression of the interior, must be evaluated from the human standing eye level. A building can only be evaluated, as Wright said, when you know the building on the ground. The artist Joseph Albers noted our increasing dependence on photographs rather than our own memories, pointing out that the visual and spatial memory is so poorly trained in general education and thus in contemporary society as a whole, that while most people can easily recall a tune that they recently heard, very few people can remember the extension of space and volume, the characteristics of the room that they only recently occupied. Yet while the exterior form best captured in photographs almost invariably devolves into the production of self-referential objects and surfaces, place form may be said to only emerge from an engagement of the experiential life world and recognition of the inherent interiority of inhabited space. As opposed to the distancing effect of the purely visual experience of looking at the exterior form of a building and placing it in front of us as an isolated sculptural object. In our embodied experience of an interior space, the room literally surrounds us, engaging all our senses, touch, hearing, smell, taste, vision, creating the sense of embodied haptic intimacy and bringing things near to us. Wright wrote that architecture was primarily involved with providing use and comfort for its inhabitants. This is right. Human use and comfort should have intimate possession of every interior, end quote. And that's an extremely early quote, by the way, before 1900. A building is not the object of our focused attention, but rather, as Wright noted, a work of architecture should be the background or framework in which the rituals of our daily lives take place. Juhani Palasmaa pointed out that when operating in isolation, the eye is the organ of separation and distance, whereas touch is the sense of nearness, intimacy, and affection. Noting that the visual experience of interior space relies less on focused vision and more on peripheral vision, giving us an intimate sense of our body being enclosed by the surrounding walls, floor, and ceiling. This is Blossom again. Peripheral vision integrates us with the space. emotional sense, end quote. Dewey's thinking closely parallels that of Wright, as is illustrated in the sighting of falling water. Edgar Kaufman was surprised to find that Wright, that's the site plan up in the upper left, commissioned by Kaufman. Kaufman was surprised to discover that Wright had placed the house on top of the waterfall, where it cannot be seen from inside the house, rather than across the stream, where he proposed it to be in his site survey. Wright told Kaufman, "I want you to live with the waterfall, not just look at it, but for it to become an integral part of your lives," end quote. Wright indicated the difference between hearing the waterfall, an intimate experience of being near, and looking at the waterfall, a formal distance experience. And this is Wright again. Kaufman loved the site where the house was built and liked to listen to the waterfall, so that was the prime motive of the design. He lives intimately with the thing that he loves, end quote. Here it's intriguing to note that according to its canonical histories, modern architecture began with an almost exclusive focus on interior space, as is reflected in Gideon's Space-Time in Architecture and Bruno Zevi's Architecture as Space, both of which trace the history of architecture as the history of the evolution of the manipulation of interior space. Yet interior space is both shaped and constructed in architecture, and it can be argued that the initial space obsession of early modern architecture and its subsequent devolution into today's object obsession has acted to overshadow architecture is on the inside. I do not see it according to its exterior envelope. I live in it from the inside. I am immersed in it. After all, the world is around me, not in front of me. That's a paraphrase of Cézanne. 3 early modern conceptions of interior space. The 3 most influential spatial discoveries of early modern architecture, which I would argue are still in use today in ordering contemporary works, whether they're acknowledged or not, all began with an inspiration about interior spatial experience. All 3 of these initiatory design conceptions are physically incorporated of the entire design, giving form and order to the space within to be lived in. The ground plan shaped and formed the interior space, and the only reason to shape the space within was for the experience of the inhabitants. Wright's woven plan, my term, a layering of the floor and ceiling that related directly to Oriental concepts of the ground platform and the roof canopy, resulted in buildings characterized by an unprecedented and still largely unmatched degree of both spatial freedom and formal order. Wright is famous for his destruction of the room. Wright actually increased both the precision and the ambiguity of spatial definition in his rooms. In this, he may be said to have re-engaged issues of space-making and inhabitation, and grappled with the questions of how one defines a volume, a place, and an experience in space. Wright's system of design was measured by, scaled by, and calibrated precisely to the human body and the experience of inhabitation. As Wright said, form became feeling. The interior spaces of Wright's buildings appeal at a fundamental level to the occupant's sense of embodied presence and bodily movement interpreted through their experience. Wright conceived of the room as being composed of a series of horizontal layers of space from the floor to the ceiling with varying wall and beam heights between, which are carefully modulated to the human scale, to the occupant's activity and the resulting position of the eye. In Wright's interiors, the intellectual and formal order of the plan is balanced by the physical and spiritual engagement of the inhabitant. For Wright, concept and experience are one and the same. The interiors of Wright's houses are constructed of multiple spaces formed by the contrapuntal axial and cross-axial directions of the volumes defined by the floors and the ceilings, which are woven together and held in tension. As a result, the experience of moving within the interior is defined not so much by bounding walls as by the syncopated spatial rhythm of compression and release formed between the more dynamic ceilings overhead and the more stable floors underfoot as they overlap and intersect with one another. The primary generator of the space within was the ground plan. This is Wright. A good plan is the beginning and the end. Its development in all directions is inherent, inevitable. Adolf Loos's round plan, each of the primary public rooms of the house has its own appropriate proportions, light quality, material character, and its own position in plan and section, leading to plans that are fractured into multiple levels, forming a kind of domestic interior terrain or topography. Loos described his work as, quote, the solution of how to arrange the living rooms in 3 dimensions, not on the flat plane. For that is the great revolution in architecture, the 3-dimensional rendering of the ground plan, end quote. Loos characterized his room plans as being primarily concerned with the making of rooms appropriate for their respective occupations, carefully positioned in space and precisely related to each other, and as a result, he was not concerned with the formal resolution of his floor plans. This is Loos again. My work does not really have floor plans. It only has connected rooms. Each room requires a particular height, which accounts for the different floor levels. The room must then be connected in such a way as to make the transition imperceptible and to effect it in a natural and efficient fashion. In daily use, the complex interlocking of the interior domestic spaces of Loos's buildings tend to maximize the opportunities for interaction of the inhabitants within the house while minimizing their contact with the exterior world. As a result, the interior spaces of Loos's domestic architecture are defined almost entirely by the position of the inhabitants' bodies, their views through the complexly interlocked spaces, and whom they are able to see and to hear. Due to the embodied experience of interior space that he sought in his designs, Loos was against having his interiors photographed. Photography, this is Loos, photography renders insubstantial, whereas what I want in my rooms is for people to feel substance around them, for it to act upon them, for them to know the enclosed space, to feel the fabric, the wood, above all to perceive it sensually with sight and touch, for them to dare to sit comfortably, end quote. In Le Corbusier's Plan Libre, the free plan, the floor plan, which is of course perhaps the most influential of the 3, the floor plane is occupied by freely shaped, non-load-bearing walls which are independent of the column grid and which form interior spaces that fluctuate in their relationship to each other as the inhabitant moves through them. Le Corbusier's concept of the marriage of contours, which he applied to both his paintings, his purist paintings, and the interior spaces of his architecture, referred to the sharing or echoing of profiles that allows objects or spaces to mesh together like the gears in a machine, one line wall serving as the edge of more than one object space. The marriage of contours in Le Corbusier's free plans allows an overlapping, intersection, integrating, and layering of interior spaces, wherein the wall is developed as the profile or contour that's shared by 2 or more spaces. In Le Corbusier's free plan, the rectangular floor plane is occupied by straight, angled, and curving walls, all freely disposed to shape the space of inhabitation, and the movement path. Le Corbusier described the experience of walking through the interior spaces formed by the walls of the free plan as the promenade architecturale, an interior conception par excellence, wherein the concave curve creates an interior surrounded by a convex curved exterior, only to reverse a few steps later in the movement sequence. This sharing of profiles or contours allows a figure ground fluctuation of spatial interpretations, as inside concave and outside convex are no longer set, and a reversal occurs as we walk from one inside to another inside during our promenade architecturale. The free plan allowed Le Corbusier to construct interiors characterized by spatial ambiguity and multiple viewpoints that are experienced in walking through the spaces of a building. The free plan and the promenade architecturale shapes are essentially about interior space, ordered by the experience of the inhabitant as they move through the carefully orchestrated sequence of unfurling interior volumes. The topographic character of the floor planes of the free plan may also be related to Le Corbusier's contemporary study of the work of the theatrical designer Adolphe Appia, who defined architecture as the grouping of anchored masses, Appia paint drawing in the upper left. Appia, who defined architecture as the grouping of anchored masses into rhythmic spaces, rectangular terrains revealed by light and shadow, which are arranged and measured according to the scale of the living body and intended for the movement of that body, end quote. The separate paths of the eye and the body in experience. A shared characteristic of the majority of spatial concepts developed in early modern architecture is that they were all developed in opposition to the manner of designing buildings that was promulgated by the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the dominant design method in the 19th and first quarter of the 20th century in both Europe and in the Americas. The vast majority of buildings designed by École des Beaux-Arts trained architects, irrespective of function and location, are organized using strict axial planning and bilateral symmetry. In use, the eye of the inhabitant saw down the central axis on which their body would eventually move to reach the axially aligned goal. So the paths of the eye and the path of the body in following the movement route to the destination are exactly the same. Yet when the eye and the body are equally engaged in the inhabitation of architecture, as Palasma points out, the eye and the visual sense invariably dominates the experience, overpowering the other subtler senses, including the synesthetic, the haptic sense of bodily position in space. In counterpoint to this visual-centric approach, early modern buildings shared the characteristic that the path of the inhabitant's eye was almost never the same as the path of the body. Rather than seeing and moving along the same central axis through the same sequence of spaces, the inhabitant meandered in plan and section through the interior spaces of the building. While the inhabitant may have been able to see directly to the goal or destination, their body was unable to physically navigate that route, and they were encouraged to find a different path, taking their eye off the goal and thus becoming aware of other internal vistas, as well as perceiving multiple viewpoints of the same interior spaces. Wright utilized axial symmetry in a way that made entry and movement through the interior spaces of his buildings more complex and ambiguous than was to be expected, given their seemingly simple and often symmetrical exterior forms. Wright varied the space, material, and natural light along the spiraling entry sequence in contrast to those characterizing the final goal. You move through a dark, compressed, circuitous, peripheral route leading to a bright, expansive central space. In allowing the inhabitants to move only along the edges of spaces and to enter rooms at their corners rather than at their centers, Wright's interiors are initially perceived as unfolding series of dynamic centrifugal diagonal views across interlocking rectangular rooms. Yet upon arriving in the center of each room, it is perceived as being centripetally anchored at its ends by symmetrical walls that face each other along the room's central axis. Wright designed the movement sequence of the occupant to be a counterpoint to the pure geometries, modular grid, and axial symmetry of his floor plans. For Wright, the inhabitant's position was as important as the spatial composition in determining the experience of his architecture. Adolf houses all present rigorously axial symmetrical facades on the street with central entryways and paired windows, often suggesting a mask-like facial features. Yet once inside, the entry axis is blocked, and the inhabitants are invited to execute a series of right-angle turns up short flights of stairs with numerous landings. Drawn upwards by the natural light, one ascends in a labyrinthian, repeatedly turning movement sequence up to the main floor of the house with its subtly stepped topography. The complex labyrinthian intertwining of rooms, floor levels, openings, stairs, and landings creates a series of carefully calibrated vantage points within the main rooms from which the inhabitant is able, by moving only a few steps, to gain an entirely different view from one room into the next. Le Corbusier's 1923 book, Vers une Architecture, mistranslated as Towards a New Architecture in English, was a sustained argument for the ancient principles of architectural order to be re-engaged in the new works not tied to the dominant école Beaux-Arts design methods. He diagrammed the proportional regulating lines, as he called them, which structured the facades of historical monuments, and presented the lessons of Rome to be found in interior spaces of the Pantheon and Santa Maria in Cosmodin, which are all available to the modern architect. In a similar way to both Wright and Loos, Le Corbusier's early houses almost invariably had symmetrical front facades, and the columns that structure their floor plans were often organized in syncopated grids, alternating wide and narrow bays, a characteristic shared with the domestic plans of Palladio. Between the front door and the final destination, often an exterior terrace, open to the sky and the landscape, rather than the living room or the dining room, the inhabitant is led through the meandering path of the Promenade Architecturale, crossing and recrossing the central axis of symmetry in a series of diagonal movements, culminating in a dynamically asymmetrical and almost entirely open rear facade, such as at Garches here. In the spatial itineraries of the eye and the body, the exceptions prove the rule. The New York Public Library, completed in 1911 to the designs of the École des Beaux-Arts trained Carrère and Hastings, entering on axis through the central door and into the central hall, one finds the central axis across the hall blocked to bodily movement, while the destination is seen to be ahead and above. the top of the entry stair, one must then choose to ascend either the staircase on the right or the left. And the movement sequence only comes back to the central axis at the plan at the very top of the building, where one finds oneself in the main reading room situated above the 6 floors of book stacks, the height of which one just measured in the ascension of the stairs. Related to the concept of the separate paths of the eye and the body, Paul Valéry remarked on the essential nature of the experience of the body enclosed in space in his 1921 dialogue, Apollinos, or the Architect. This is Valéry. When I design a building, I confess, however strange it may appear to you, that it seems to me my body is playing its part in the game. It is through their body that people participate in what they see and what they touch. They touch and they are touched, end quote. Among the numerous examples of the ways concepts of interior space and its perception are shared by early modern architects and artists would be the intention to break the exterior box that characterized both Wright's early work and as well as the spatial designs of the Gestile artists Gerrit Rietveld, Theo van Doesburg, and Piet Mondrian, who I'm showing his Salon de Madame B at Dresden of 1926 in a 1970 reconstruction. The shape of interior space and the boundary of place. The tradition of architecture defined as interior space, going back to ancient times and extending through contemporary works, is one where the building may be said to be conceived not as an exterior form, but as an outer surface of interior space, the interior skin of the inhabited room, in which the building allows the interior place of experience and inhabitation to unfold within the limits that boundaries set by the outer forms. This inside-out reading of architecture, one determined by the outer boundary, surface, and shape of the interior space, was best summarized by Aldo van Eyck in his 1958 appreciation of Gerrit Rietveld. And this is Van Eyck. Rietveld was one of the few to create space, not so much by material boundaries, but by the shaping of light. Rietveld is at his strongest when he is concerned with a single, separate space, whether or not its form is complex. Here, the periphery of the space constitutes the matter of its envelopment. Rietveld approaches the tangible, that which he must draw and construct, by way of the intangible, by the way of light and space. Rietveld succeeds in approaching the material with which he has to build from the viewpoint of space, and not, as is usual, from the other way around. The emphasis of early modern architects on the shaping of the inner skin as defining inhabited space, as experienced from the interior, was inspired and reinforced by Auguste Choisy's Histoire de l'Architecture of 1899, the most important book of architectural history in the education of the first and second generation of modern architects, including Le Corbusier and Louis Kahn, among many others. The book's 1,760 line drawings of buildings throughout history emphasize the enveloping wall mass and the shaped volume of interior space, showing almost nothing of the exterior of the buildings they depict, and instead strongly emphasizing the interior surfaces of the walls and ceilings and the way those two come together to shape and define the interior space. In counterpoint in 1952, Luigi Moretti reinforced this interpretation in some ways in his essay, Structures and Sequences of Spaces. He noted that the idea that interior space was the originating idea of architecture, as well as the primary reason for constructing buildings, was very clear to the ancients, he said. For centuries, the conquests and resolution of internal spaces coincides with the very history of architecture itself, end quote. Moretti illustrates his essay with a series of plaster castings of interior spaces of selected historical buildings. It was as if the inhabited interior voids had been solidified and the containing mass of the outer walls, like the formwork of concrete, had been stripped away, a process that he called internal stereotometry. Moretti's approach is complemented and contrasted by the drawings of Peter Maep for human inhabitation. This type of drawing is a way of sensing precisely the spatial skins enclosing the rooms in which we live, and involves the active touching and shaping of the space of inhabitation, much as a potter shapes the clay to the form of the inner wall of a vessel. The monk and architect Dom Hans van der Laan took an anthropological approach to the definition of inhabited space in his 1983 book, Architectonic Space. He defined the space formed by humans as what he calls experience space, which is determined from within by our bodily presence. In making this space of inhabitation, quote, the void, the form of the space, is wholly dependent on the solid, the form of the mass. Space gets its form and hence its visibility from the involvement with the form of the wall. Walls are made, interior spaces come into being, and we know a volume by its bounding surfaces. Martin Heidegger also takes the idea of architecture back to its origins in inhabited interior space in his essay Building Dwelling Thinking of 1954. This is Heidegger. The word for space, Raum, means a place cleared or freed for settlement and lodging. A space is something that has been made room for, something that is cleared and free, namely within a boundary, which is the Greek word peras. A boundary is not that at which something stops, but as the Greeks recognized, the boundary is that from which something begins its essential unfolding. After visiting Frank Lloyd Wright's Tokyo Imperial Hotel in 1966, Aldo van Eyck noted that both the way that its wall masses tended to make even small spaces feel much larger in experience, and the way the folding of Wright's ambiguously bounded spaces produced what he called an inner horizon of experience. This is Van Eyck. As you walk up from one floor level to another, you carry the horizon of space with you. The horizon is not a relative thing. It relates to you. The horizon is a relative thing. It relates to you, to where you are. What matters is not so much the space, but the interior of the space and the inner horizon of the interior space. One is subsequently received from space to space and from level to level. This interior horizon can be sensed everywhere. Architecture can do no more than assist that reassuring feeling of being interiorized, end quote. In describing the design of his own Petit Cabanon, Le Corbusier said that exterior and roof framing are not related to the current problem, which, as Roberto Gargiani and Anna Rossellini have noted, quote, suggests a certain indifference regarding the exterior with respect to his focus on the complex functioning of the residential cell, so much so that the envelope is translated into what Le Corbusier called a sort of bag of its skin, end quote. Similarly, in describing the way the interior space actively shaped embossing, but hollow. The Irish architects Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara of Grafton Architects, this is a quote from a lecture they gave, I believe possibly at Piran. In one of his seemingly absurd quotes, Alejandro de la Sota says about architecture, quote, this is de la Sota, one has to achieve as much of nothing as possible. And then the Graftons go on, we understand this nothing as the space in between, the space between the interior and the exterior, between the ground and the sky, as the space containing light, air, volume, the space where we stand. The building material is the opposite of nothing. We're interested in something which is nothing. We're interested in the space, the volume, the place. That which is nothing is something. The Society of Spaces and the Emplacement of Encounters. Following Wright's reestablishment of the place within as the fundamental generative concept for architecture and the subsequent development of the three floor plan types of Wright, Loos, and Le Corbusier, it could be argued that it was Louis Kahn who most effectively evolved the insight that, and this is Kahn, the room is the beginning of architecture, into the design concept that he calls the floor plan as a society of spaces. Kahn's redefinition began by establishing the individual character of each room and then reconceiving the composition of the floor plan as the ordering of these independent spaces into a social structure, their spatial relationship articulating the collective institutional purpose of the building. This is Kahn. I think the most inspirational point from which we might try to understand architecture is to regard the room, the simple room, as the beginning of architecture. I think that a plan is a society of spaces. A real plan is one in which the rooms have talked to each other. The form of a school could be something to do with the conversation of various rooms, their nature, and how they complement each other and enrich the environment with the feeling of it being a good place to learn, end quote. In order to be an appropriate place for a given activity, Kahn believed each room should have its own light, its own structure, which he called the beginning of containment, and its own clearly articulated and perceivable spatial boundaries, resulting in each room having a sense of individuality, independence, and identity as an element or an entity in this society of spaces. This is Kahn. You might say that the nature of a room is that it always has a character of completeness. The self-defined, self-centered, and self-supporting room entities are arranged and assembled as independent volumes with individual characters in a larger plan as a society of spaces. In saying architecture is a thoughtful making of spaces, Kahn argued that the programming of architectural design should re-engage the full range of human experience and social association, and that the most important function of any building is to enrich, enhance, and ennoble the daily life that takes place within their spaces. Kahn's belief that the generosity of interior space directly determines the quality of life that takes place within it is reflected in his telling his students at University of Pennsylvania that the qualitative level of a civilization is measured by the shape and height of your ceiling. Kahn believed that the most important room in a building was most often not named in the program of spaces that were given to the architect, and that it was the responsibility of the architect to argue for the space which he called the room with no name. The two most exceptional examples would be the courtyard of Salk Institute, which was not in the program, and the central space of Exeter Library. Kahn believed that rooms composed the plan as a society of spaces not only needed to accommodate the specific planned uses and functions that were required by the institution, but more importantly should make places in the plan for spaces for unplanned meetings and chance encounters, which he believed were the generators of social and cultural relations that he considered to be the true purpose of architecture. Kahn argued that the individual room entity is related to the society of spaces by the places of entrance, the galleries that radiate from them, the intimate entrances to the spaces of the institution, which form an independent architecture of connection, his term. This connecting architecture consists of the spaces of movement, thresholds, foyers, vestibules, hallways, arcades, intersections, porches, staircases, and their landings, which Kahn called the experiential events of a building, and which he believed were generative of unstructured socializing and unplanned meetings. The classrooms in Kahn's Indian Institute of Management are connected by entrance foyers that overlap with the wide arcaded hallway along the edge of the building's central court, so that the foyers of the classroom are equal in size to the classrooms that they serve, and they're better illuminated and better ventilated. In Wright's Larkin building, the collective experience within the building was centered on the vertical atrium, which rather than imposing a hierarchical structure, spatial or social, was deployed to allow the office workers who were accommodated on the spatial middle floors to overlook the company executives who occupied the ground floor. The top floor, normally the province of the executives, was instead occupied by the employee restaurant, where Wright emphasized the collective attitude of the company by designing the dining tables, upper left, with raised posts at their narrow end so that it was not possible for the executives or anyone else who took their meals with the employees to sit at the head of the table. There was no head of the table. In his 19th in the Dana House, which has virtually no corridors, and all the rooms have more than one door, and all the rooms open to each other, so that one must move through the rooms to reach other rooms. Evans described this kind of plan as belonging to, quote, an architecture arising out of the deep fascination that draws people towards others, an architecture that recognizes passion, carnality, and sociality. The matrix of interconnected rooms might well be an integral feature of such buildings, end quote. The nesting of places at once intimate and immense. The interior experience of the room that is composed of a nesting of spaces that are at once intimate and immense, connecting us to the earth and the sky, the distant horizon and the cosmos, at the same moment that it surrounds us with appropriately scaled surfaces and details that we engage at first hand, grounding us in the tactile touch. Antonello Damascena's painting Saint Jerome in his study on the left presents a view of the saint sitting at a wooden desk set within a raised wooden room with his books and intimate belongings surrounding him and within easy reach. This double-layered wooden-walled room, small and intimate, warm to the touch and sheltering the body, in turn stands within a larger, taller, massive masonry-walled space, cold, hard, and uninviting to the touch, which is itself one bay of a multi-bayed sanctuary structure. The way in which the entire space, from the individual body scale of the built-in furnishings to the collective public space of the stone vaulting of the masonry church are all precisely scaled by and ordered by the interior experience of the inhabitant, the monk in his study, makes this a definitive demonstration of the conception of simultaneous intimacy and immensity in the space within. One of the most inspiring examinations of the related concepts of intimacy and immensity in interior rooms is to be found in Gaston Bachelard's The Poetics of Space. In examining the simultaneity of intimacy and immensity of interior space, Bachelard focused on the house of our childhood as a prime example. The nesting of space within space and the resulting miniature world within a world that is created for the inhabitants is exemplified for Bachelard by the light cast upon the table in the darkness of night. Quote, "The evening lamp on the family table is also the center of a world. In fact, the lamp-lighted table is Potato Eaters of 1885. Quote, a lamp hanging over the table defines the center of attention. The light it sheds enables people to jointly shape the space so that there is ultimately a fusion between the people and the place," end quote. In defining his conceptual pairing, intimate immensity, Bachelard argued that both intimate and immense scales of experience characterize memorable rooms. He noted how, like the forest, an interior space, quote, accumulates its infinity within its own boundaries, and that a place invested with intimate space becomes the center of all space for its occupants, and that in their experience, the horizon exists as much as the center, end quote. In his conclusion, Bachelard argued that in experience, the space within and the inhabitant become one, and paralleling right held that to allow the inhabitants to experience repose was the most important function of the room. This is Bachelard. The intimacy of the rooms become our intimacy. It no longer limits us because we are in the very ultimate depth of the repose that has been conferred on us, end quote. Wright employed this concept of nesting spaces, smaller spaces set within larger spaces and rooms, so that his buildings were composed of similar elements repeated at varying scales. The paired structural piers of Wright's houses together shape a space of nesting inhabitable volumes from the scale of the building down to the scale of the individual. Complementing this is Wright's interweaving of spaces of differing proportions, where a series of piers of different heights are projected different lengths from the central cubic volume to form a series of nested horizontal planes and multiple bounded edges. Wright evolved complementary and contrasting spatial experiences for public and private buildings. The interior experience of Wright's Unity Temple is at once immense, the skylit vertical central volume suspending the inhabitants in an ethereal light from above, and it's also intimate, all inhabitants being drawn close together as members of a family gathered for worship. The interior experience of Wright's Martin House is at once immense, where the interweaving fabric of the space extends outward to the distant horizon. But it's also intimate, where nested spaces within spaces cluster around the massive solid hearth at the center of the house. The interpreting of individual rooms as small buildings within the larger building is a conception first articulated, at least as we know, by Leon Battista Alberti. This is Alberti. If a city is like a large house, and the house is in turn like some small city, cannot the various rooms of the house be considered miniature buildings? End quote. Louis Kahn gave embodied form to Alberti's concept in his Fort Wayne Performing Arts Center, conceiving the building within a building with the violin, as he called the auditorium, enclosed by cast concrete walls, being set within the violin case, the lobby, access stairs, and foyer, an outer enclosure of masonry that surrounded and protected the auditorium within. Kahn's nesting of buildings within buildings may be said to reach its climax in his assembly building at Dhaka, an intensely nested spatial composition constructed of 8 layers of walls, forming 8 types of spaces, extending from the outer wall of the surrounding lake to the inner wall of the central assembly hall itself. Peter Zumthor noted that the most engaging experiences take place within buildings that are composed using 2 kinds of space. This is Zumthor: the closed architectural body that isolates space within itself, and the open body that embraces the area of space that is connected within the endless continuum, end quote. This pairing of intimacy and immensity is exemplified for him in Palladio's Teatro Olimpico. This is Zumthor: steep rows, the wood worn and aged, great intimacy, a powerful sense of space, end quote. In his book, Inside Architecture, Vittorio Gregotti noted that recent architectural practice has been less and less about designing freestanding buildings and more about nesting new buildings inside of existing older buildings, which is the definition, if there ever was one, of Carlos Scarpa's practice. Scarpa's designs involve weaving together historical and contemporary fabric to construct rooms that are intimate and immense in both their spatial and experiential characters. Adolf Loos's Kartner bar, combined in Vienna, combines in experience the visual immensity of the infinite reflections of the coffered ceiling in the above eye-level mirrors and the physical intimacy of nestling one's body into the low leather banquettes, two experiences usually considered mutually exclusive brought together. Altos designs for large living rooms, housing all the shared spaces of the house and anchored by a large masonry fireplace, are directly related to the Finnish farmhouse's immense single room, the so-called tupa, an all-wooden forest womb anchored by the fireplace, stove, oven, and intimately enclosing all the spaces of domestic life. Le Corbusier's Petit Cabanon, his own house, was the architect's place of retreat from the civilized world into the intimacies of what he called primitive interior life, a space precisely proportioned and scaled to house his own body and that of his wife, Yvonne. At the same time he built the Petit Cabanon, Corbusier was evolving in works such as as Ronchamp and La Tourette, his conception of emotionally resonant interior space, which he called ineffable space, with its clear intimations of immensity and infinity. Making room for experience and memory. The primary and long-lasting effect on those who dwell within it, as is reflected in their embodied memories of these experiences and the way those spaces both house and shape their actions. In describing the power of what he called fixed feature space, a room engendering both habitual use and embodied memory on the lives of the inhabitants, Edward Hall noted, quote, "It is the mold into which a great deal of behavior is cast. It was this feature of space that the late Winston Churchill referred to when he said, quote, 'We shape our buildings and they shape us.'" In his book, Remembering, Edward Casey traces the understanding of emplaced memory to the ancient Greeks, who believed that while time was inherently dispersive, place was inherently collective, and that in the Greek, the art of memory, the role of place was altogether central. He quotes Aristotle, "Place is a vessel, i.e. a container," end quote. While human action and experience is transitory, it is the stabilizing persistence of place as a container of experiences that contributes so powerfully to its intrinsic memorability. That's Casey. In exploring the way in which lived experiences and recollected memories are embodied within rooms that are conceived as places of inhabitation, we begin with rooms that employ the modern material glass to provide their inhabitants with a simultaneous sense of extending out to connect to the distant horizon, immensity, prospect, and withdrawing into the close places of refuge, intimacy, repose, and refuge. Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House is a prime example of the modern all-glass building, which, due to the complete transparency of the bounding walls, may be defined as all prospect and no refuge, or alternately, as the prospect of the inhabitant across the landscape of the building becoming their refuge. Frank Lloyd Wright's Fallingwater is an example of a building that engages prospect and refuge in equal and balanced manner. From within the deeply shadowed refuge of the interior, one's view is not of the waterfall below, but of the canopies of the surrounding trees. The houses of Adolf Loos exemplify buildings which, due to the almost complete translucency or opacity of the bounding walls, may be defined as all refuge and no prospect, or alternatively, as the prospect being directed inwards towards the refuge so that the vista without is the vista within. Le Corbusier wrote, "Loos told me one day, quote, 'A cultivated man does not look out of the window. It is there only to let light in, not to let the gaze pass through.'" That's Le Corbusier quoting Adolf Loos. The most remarkable example of this all refuge and no prospect type is in fact built almost entirely of glass, Pierre Chareau's Maison de Verre in Paris. The interior of the house is experienced as a cave of glass. Its exterior walls built almost entirely of translucent glass blocks so that the open interior space is a refuge enclosed by luminous walls paradoxically flooded with light while being given only the most minimal prospect to the outside. Lived experiences and recollected memories are embodied within rooms that are anchored to their sites and thereby integrated into the history and nature of their place. In Carlos Scarpa's Gypsoteca Canoviana, the taller gallery is experienced as an intentional echo of Canova's studio, which is in the same building complex. The studio, the place of initial creative conception, and the gallery, the place of display of the fabricated products of the conception. The two rooms share dimensions and proportions precisely. Scarpa's gallery is in fact Canova's studio tilted on its end, and also the window position in the pushing of the windows to the ceiling. In counterpoint to the embodied memory of built places are those rooms anchored to their sites through their engagement of the memory of natural places, experienced as an echo of the landscape enclosed inside the room. The sanctuary of Jorn Utsen's Bagsverad Church outside Copenhagen is a room that recollects and transforms the memory of landscape as a place of dwelling on the earth and under the sky. Lived experiences and recollected memories are embodied within rooms that are resonant with the memory of their making, legible in their structure, materials, and joinery. Peter Zumthor's Bruder Klaus Chapel was made of tree trunks arranged in a tent-like configuration, around which concrete was cast, and after which the tree trunks were burned out, leaving an interior characterized by their curved imprint, black soot, and strong smell of smoke. Lived experiences and recollected memories are embodied within rooms brought to life by the play of light throughout the day, the season, and the year. Louis Kahn wrote, "We are born of light. To me, natural light is the only light because it has mood. It provides a common ground of agreement for man. It puts us in touch with the eternal," end quote. In Exeter Library, the great top-lit room of the building center where we see all the books is balanced by individually taking the book to the light, which you can see there. And then in counterpoint, the Kimball Museum, one moves through a series of rooms formed not by the walls, but by the extended concrete vaults overhead, each of which paradoxically both shades the interior from the hot sun and gives it light. Finally, lived experiences and recollected memories are embodied within rooms tailored precisely to the rituals of daily life that takes place within them. In the Villa Savoie on the upper left, the top-lit master bathroom, the only room that is actually not on the outside wall of the house, is separated from, but also connected to the master bedroom by a tiled chaise lounge, from which one can look out into the forest. In contrast, in the Petite Maison on the lower right and bottom, designed for his parents on Lake Geneva, the garden room's single view of the mountains and lake was framed by a small square opening into the sill of which a table was built. And this was where Le Corbusier had dinner with his mother after his father passed. In their recognition of the primacy of the experience of the interior room and its importance in this as a setting for daily rituals and events of life, architects are paralleled by writers, as indicated by the way rooms shape the lives and memories of authors and the characters portrayed in literature. In the opening scene of Simon Maurer's novel, The Glass Room, which is based on, the building actually, is based on Mies van der Rohe's Tugendhat house. The now blind owner returns to visit the house she's abandoned 30 years before. This is Maurer, quote, "She could feel the volume as though it had physical substance, as though her face were immersed in it. Space made manifest. She could feel the light. Light became substance, soft, transparent milk. The glass room is an ageless place, held in a rectangular frame that handles light like substance and volume like a tangible material and denies the very existence of time." In Curzio Malaparte's autobiographical novel, The Skin, he describes a visit, which actually occurred, by Field Marshal Rommel to his house, the so-called Villa Malaparte. Quote, "We returned to the vast hall and its great windows, which look out onto the most beautiful scenery in the world. Before leaving, Rommel asked me whether I bought my house as it stood or whether I designed and built it myself. I replied, and it was not true, that I had bought the house as it stood. And with the sweeping gesture indicating the sheer cliff, the three gigantic rocks, the peninsula, the islands, the faraway blue coastline, and the golden sands shimmering in the distance, I said to him, I designed the scenery." The interior experience of the exterior environment, which is the last chapter. It may seem paradoxical at first mention, but the interior experience of the exterior environment is in fact a critical aspect of this conception of interior primacy in architecture. Architects whose interior spaces remain in our memory have invariably been acutely sensitive to the local climate, the constant change of the seasons and natural light, and the larger environment in which the building is placed, and how all these can be engaged to enrich the experience of the inhabitants. Yet the now virtually universal mechanical air conditioning of interior spaces, the hermetic sealing of buildings which cuts the occupants off from any contact other than visual with their climate and environment, has led to a steady erosion of our perceived need for protective and porous layers of construction and materials that are warm or cool to the touch, depending on the season. Before air conditioning, architects had no choice but to engage their climate and natural context. In response to this environmental imperative, early modern architects engaged local traditions of ecologically responsive building. The sense of natural economy as an ethic of building, gaining the maximum benefit for the inhabitants of its interiors in terms of the enrichment of the daily rituals of life over the lifetime of the building, from the least energy and material investment, has always been part of architecture that has lasted. One of the primary themes of modern architecture, articulated most clearly by Wright, is intertwining the interior space with exterior landscape. He believed daily life should take place in the presence of nature, which should be an integral part of the interior experience. His interior spaces allowed inhabitants to experience the close relationship between architecture, which is to build and to edify, and agriculture, which is to care for and cultivate the land, as related ways of tending and transforming the landscape. In Wright's Usonian houses, the garden takes up the geometric center of both the site and the plan drawing, and is the focus of the entire spatial composition. The paired perspectives upper right that Wright drew of a prototypical Usonian house of 1935 reveals the reading of outside and inside that he intended. The street view, lower, is an elevated viewpoint off the ground, indicating that we are outside the house, looking at the closed object in the landscape. Compare this to the matched garden view above, eye level on the ground, where we are standing in the garden, the most important room of the house, and we are enclosed by the extending arms of the house. Wright argued for integrity of design and an integration of exterior environment and interior experience. Quote, "The Usonian house then aims to be a natural performance, one that's integral to site, integral to the environment, and integral to the life of its inhabitants." Wright's integration of architecture, environment, and climate was highlighted in 1969, 10 years after his death, when Rayner Banham noted, among other innovative environmental control features of the Roby House of 1909, that the south roof overhang shaded the glazing doors running along the side of the house with a level of precision that was shocking to those who assumed energy efficiency had only much more recently been discovered as a determinant of architectural form. I might add that Banham didn't notice that in the winter, when I visited the house on the shortest day of the year, December 22nd, the sun comes all the way across and touches the inner corner and warms the entire concrete floor of the living room. Not a coincidence. In Art as Experience, John Dewey argued that the initial impulse to build and to make is inspired by the loss of integration with the environment and the desire for recovery of that union. In what could be a description of a Frank Lloyd Wright house, such as Falling Water, Dewey wrote, "Through going out into the environment, position unfolds into volume. Through pressure of environment, mass is retracted into energy of position, and space remains, when matter is contracted, as an opportunity for further action." In a 1926 commentary on Fra Angelico's The Annunciation, entitled From Doorstep to Living Room, Alto interpreted the painting as showing an interplay between interior and exterior space. This is Alto. This is 1926, so extremely early. The picture provided an ideal example of entering a room. The trinity of human being, room, and garden, shown in the picture, make it an unattainable ideal image for the house. The garden, or courtyard, belongs to the house just as much as any of the rooms, end quote. Of the covered terrace of Le Corbusier's pavilion, Esprit Nouveau, several images there, which was in the same article, Alto asked, is it a hall, beautifully open to the exterior, or is it a garden built into the house, a garden room? Alto also engaged the single-room finished farmhouse, which in a seemingly infinite darkness of the Arctic winter forms an intimate interior world within, as depicted on the right in Galin Kalala's first lesson, showing a child reading by the light of a small deep window cut through the thick walls of her farmhouse, her book catching the window's cold blue-white light, while her father's face is illuminated by the faint reddish glow of the fire within. An indication of the subtle relationship between the encompassing environment and the room within may be found in Alto's criticism of the tubular steel framed furnishings designed by Marcel Breuer. It's this Alto's apartment, upper left. After experiencing how the metal frames conducted heat away from the body during the Nordic winter, resulting in discomfort for the occupants, Alto developed his own bent word frame furnishing, which were clearly inspired by the Breuer, with leather-wrapped door handles and wood-wrapped steel columns. From the very start of his career, Le Corbusier had argued against the traditional separation of interior and exterior, stating in 1930, "The outside is always an inside." Later, while he was working in India, Le Corbusier described the courtyard of an old building which had a view of a nearby dome. "It is a very interesting interior-exterior." This idea of interior-exterior describes the experience of Le Corbusier's Curichet residence, where the interior rooms of domestic and work life are completely intertwined with the exterior spaces of the courtyard and the tree, as well as the park across the street. Aldo van Eyck believed that all inhabited rooms, even exterior rooms, are fundamentally interiors, and he held that all spaces designed by humankind, inside or outside, rooms or streets, are fundamentally conceived and experienced as interior spaces. The quality of interior experience, whether on the inside or outside of the buildings, is all that matters, according to Van Eyck. Quote, "It is not space that counts ultimately, but the interior of the space, and above all, the inner horizon of that interior, whether it is outside or inside." So in conclusion, interior space in this experience is the fundamental originating inspiration and essential reason for being of architecture, as well as the primary determinant of architectural design. It follows directly that the only appropriate way to evaluate architecture is through our experience of its interiors, with particular emphasis on them. In this understanding, the inhabitational character of interior space should be given primacy in the conception, construction, and design of architecture, and design of architecture, in the construction and realization of architecture, and in the experience and evaluation of the built work. This conception centers on the seemingly self-evident recognition that the appropriate enrichment of the interior experience of occupants is both the ultimate goal in the design of an architectural work, and that interior spatial experience is the only valid measure of the quality of an inhabited work of architecture. Yet the overwhelming majority of architectural publications are scripted in stylistic or purely formal terms that only recognize the exterior form and largely ignore the interior experience. As a result, while the interior experience of buildings is what really matters to those who inhabit them, today space within seems less and less interest to many of those who design those same buildings. This tendency to emphasize the exterior form over the life that takes place in the interior was noted at the very beginning of modern architecture by Eileen Gray in describing her E1027 house of 1929, same year as the Villa Savoye of Le Corbusier. Quote, this is Eileen Gray, "External architecture seems to have absorbed avant-garde architects at the expense of the interior, as if a house should be conceived for the pleasure of an eye more than for the well-being of its inhabitants. If lyricism can be dedicated to the play of masses brought together in daylight," a reference to Le Corbusier's definition, "the interior should respond to the human needs and the exigencies of individual life, and it should ensure calm and intimacy. The process is subordinate to the plan, not the plan to the process. It is not only a matter of constructing beautiful arrangements of lines, but above all, dwellings for people." Oh, maybe I stay with that. Gray's critique of the formulaic and formalist tendency she perceived in early modern architecture is equally relevant today, arguing that architectural design must always respond to its specific place and construct the atmosphere necessary to sustain a rich inner life for its inhabitants, rather than follow predetermined and generic formulas. She noted, "Formulas are nothing. Life is everything, and life is simultaneously mind and heart, end quote. Following this insight, we could say that in order to make both appropriate architectural designs as well as appropriate analyses of rooms in which we live, another definition of criticism is also required, a definition much less concerned with style and form, and much more concerned with the tradition of building, the making of places, and the experience of the space within. In light of this realization, the approach taken in this lecture begins with the actual experience of interior spaces, and with the understanding that it requires no special training or skills to have an experience, as John Dewey has noted. It is simply and crucially an integral part of everyday life. The intention is to propose a criticism that acts to bind together the perspectives of academics, critics, practitioners, and the inhabitants of architecture, precisely because these are almost always considered to be mutually exclusive discourses. Despite all the words that have been and continue to be written about architecture, the actual lived experience of those who inhabit the interior spaces of architecture, which is the ultimate purpose of our discipline, is almost entirely absent from critical discourses in architectural schools and practices, and in the public realm. Alvarado stated that what really matters in architecture was not what a building looks like on the day it opens, but on what it is like to live in 30 years later. By the way, he changed that to 50 later in his life. And this valuation of what buildings were like to be in and to experience over their exterior form is one of the shared principles of modern architecture. Embracing the primacy of interior experience in architecture involves rediscovering the fundamental ethical principles underlying the process of edification, as was indicated by Aldo van Eyck's critique of the concept of modern architecture as being defined solely by space and time. This is Van Eyck. Whatever space and time mean, place and occasion mean more, since space in the image of mankind is place, and time in the image of mankind is occasion, end quote. Van Eyck held that an event in human life is an occasion, that it takes place in the space within, and that our architecture was fundamentally about allowing what he called our homecoming, an essentially interior experience. And I'll end with a statement of Louis Kahn. Louis Kahn's deep reflection on the nature of architecture and how its nature could be engaged in his own design process led to a remarkable insight into the relationship between the functional program and architectural design, and the essential part that's played by interior spatial experience in their realization. Kahn maintained that, contrary to standard practice, architecture does not begin with a functional program of predetermined spaces in quantities, but rather with an inspiration regarding the nature of an interior space. This is Kahn. The space induces the project. If you have a space, something happens. The program then starts. It doesn't start before you make the space, end quote. Instead of the usual design process, wherein the functional program is determined well before the interior spaces are conceived, Kahn proposed the exact opposite, that the architect should begin with an idea about the nature of interior space, a room as a place of experience, and that this interior spatial conception then gives direction and meaning to the development of the program, the building design, material selection, and site situation. Thank you. Thank you also for your patience. That was long. So.
Many thanks. So we invite audience for some statements, questions.
You could have the lights up, maybe. You could have the lights up so I can see who is asking questions, or see them better anyway.
Any questions? You can disagree as well, guys. You can question things, ask things that are oppositional, voice your opinion.
Paul, what am I going to do?
I have a question.
Yes.
Thank you first for the brilliant lecture and your book, which is wonderful. What we saw amazing interiors, but hardly any people in them. Of course, it's
show that majority of them, especially Wright and Lost, are kind of totally garments, completely perfect in all the details, the furniture, the space, and with totally garments, I mean also they're very total, complete in the sense that you cannot change them in fact, because then you ruin the balance. You cannot change them through time. So these kind of environments are also quite fragile. So when you did your research, have you found in the archives some kind of statement of the architects also how they perceived the interiors after time and how they perhaps control the inhabitants or they let them be?
Well, I think
There is a variety. Wright and Loos are completely different. Loos doesn't design furniture, and in fact, he will not take a commission for a house until he sees the client's favorite chair. And then he understands how he can design the room for that chair. But Wright actually, all the photographs of Wright's buildings, at least from the Prairie period, are all the result of Wright rearranging the furniture, and they would photograph it dozens and dozens of times. So what you're seeing is pieces of furniture in a place where they are not actually normally in the life of the house, and he's using it as a test. He's quite famous for coming to visit his clients 10 years after he builds the house. And he rearranges all their furniture in the middle of the night, and it's a gift, he says. So, you know, your furniture needs to be rearranged. So it has a better spatial feeling now. But, you know, the furniture has, Wright's furniture anyway, makes little rooms within the room. So I'm not sure that it really matters where they end up as long as they are part of the composition. And his later houses, of course, he was not as interested in that. And there are built-in furnishings, but then there's a lot of others. But I do agree with you about the photos. The only architect that I have worked a lot with who refuses to have a photograph in any book of his work without people is Herman Hershberger. And in fact, all the photographs of Hershberger in my extremely too big book on him are from his office and involve, if he can't find a convenient child in a school, he brings his own kids. So they can sort of, you know, useful scale figures. But and the photo on the cover of the book actually is his own son walking away in one of the schools. So that's why I also end on this one, because I'm listening to a concert, 1,000 choral singers in Marcel Breuer's great St. John's Abbey, which is, in my opinion, his greatest building, and no one in America knows it, because it's 2 hours outside of Minneapolis, north, in the middle of bloody nowhere. And if it had been built in downtown New York, it would be the most famous building, one of the most famous in the world, but that's not the nature of a monastery. So, but I think that, because I also have experience with, there are 2 Frank Lloyd Wright houses in St. Louis. There's the Dana house that I showed is actually quite nearby. Some Wright houses have become museums, but actually not even a small fraction of his production. And those do tend to look a little bit fixed, because of course no one lives there now. It's a museum. But I interviewed many, many clients. I've been working on Wright. Wright was the first book I ever did. And I have 6 books on Wright. And I interviewed a lot of clients. And I would sometimes make a small criticism of the house, and they would not hear of it, because their statement was, "This house changed my life. Waking up in this house makes me a different person. So don't you talk about my house," you know. I was thinking, well, just a little bit, you know, no, because I come like the architect critic, but they see it as the user, as the occupant of the house, and they give them up only grudgingly, and I suspect that's also true of many others. I know it's also true of several of Stephen Hall's clients and others who live in their houses very vigorously, and they change them quite a lot. And but if the house is like Loos suggests, that it's some kind of reflection of the owner, it also has the problem that it's not able to handle another owner. And so Loos's houses, for instance, have suffered from the fact that the original owners, he designed it so particularly for them and their furniture that other people didn't feel particularly comfortable in it. And I think Wright's houses, and probably Corbusier's, also have a bit more generosity in terms of they're not for one person, they're for sort of a type, it's a way of living, but not necessarily for one person's way of living. So, and we have to, you know, the problem with designing single-family residences is they're sort of frozen in time, and it's very hard to convince your client to build a house that might be good for other people, but eventually it will be for other people. So, because it's almost inevitable these days, that we, unlike Bachelard, we do not have our family, our childhood home in our head, you know, and in our physical body for our whole lives. But, so I'm not so convinced about the perfection, because Wright's clients were just as strong as he was, and they pushed back a lot. And he got those photographs, and usually as soon as he left, the house changed. But it changed in a way that made the owner happier. So what you see is something that's frozen in time, and that's why Hershberger I appreciate, because he goes back and looks at his buildings and photographs them 10, 20 years later. And, you know, sometimes they don't look so good. They've been, you know, they didn't have enough budget. Schools just get completely hammered in terms of use. But you can also see that I was just at the Apollo Schools, 1986, with Hershberger 2 weeks ago in Amsterdam with my students. And 2 kids were sitting in the little niche next to the column. And we were just standing there talking, and the 2 kids says, "This is the best school in the world." And Hershberger was like, "Did you hear that?" He was completely unsolicited. They didn't know who we were. So they just knew we must be architects, because we were standing around talking about the building, which is, who does that? I understand the first year is here. Is this true? They won't admit it? Oh.
Let me follow that.
No, I really appreciate the first year being here, because the fact is, you don't have a lot of habits yet, so you're open to some ideas, and I think this is a great kind of thing to. I gave you a lot to think about, and I'm going to leave it here on the computer so you can look at it later if you want to. All those images. I mean, my sketches are mine, so you know, they're the way I take architecture in when I have the time. I don't always have the time, but yes, Paul.
I want to follow that statement. I think rightfully you reference a lot of iconic architecture, things that we kind of know and have interpreted perhaps differently in your point of view and your perspective. But as educators, as pedagogues, you know, we're teaching students whose clients perhaps are not as privileged, okay, or can't afford particular kinds of architecture, where the architect kind of contemplates on this as a very focused kind of, I would say, method or way, process of making architecture. And so the everyday kind of life as an architect demands different kinds of things from us. So as an educator, if you're talking to a student about the embodiment of these ideas within a project, say, okay, within an urban project or within a residential project, maybe this isn't answerable in a short period of time, but I'm very curious about how we present these ideas in a way that's not isolated within privilege, okay, that's perhaps a bit more distributed in a way. A way that you practice architecture every day. So we can admit that these are not necessarily everyday buildings. I mean, these are exceptional pieces.
Well, I wouldn't agree in terms of frankly, right, the vast majority of his buildings were very inexpensive.
We built for the middle class. They were $5,000 houses, for which we took a $500 to commission, which I wish. But in 1950, for newspaper reporters, for farmers, and that's the vast majority. And of course, what gets published is the Falling Water and other things. But that's why I always show the Usonians, because when he received the gold medal, he actually lambasted the profession. He said the one thing that American profession can't seem to deal with is the house for the middle class family. You're all too busy building these, either a mansion or this kind of low income blocks, and that there's nothing in between. And that was directed at the American profession in the 50s, which is absolutely valid. But I think you have to have an ideal. What I'm showing is the fact that the architects who really sort of forged modernism, that we sort of, for better or worse, are following in their wake, they were always engaging this interior experience. And it was, whether it's Corbusier's Petit Cabanon, which is one of the cheapest buildings you're ever going to visit. If you want to talk about the construction costs, it's practically scrap it's just stuff from the junkyard that he picked up and built to make this cabanon, which is supposed to be super primitive. That's the whole point. It's not, and that was for himself. That was like a personal container. But I think that it has to do with the programs you give. I don't give private houses. I wouldn't dream of giving a private house. I don't think it's appropriate. I think you give multifamily housing in the city. I'm giving a Montessori school right now in Florence, which is for a middle class, lower working class neighborhood in Florence. Hard to believe there is such a thing in Florence because there's so many tourists. But
I guess to a degree, I'm not making kind of a judgment or a question about class. I am kind of wondering, though, it is, I think, a discussion about pedagogy, how we embrace this within the studio environment and begin to talk about that as a tectonic kind of way of thinking and making things, generative way. And I think that it's a larger question, because I agree with you. I think that at least as far as many of our students receive things, they are kind of through the immediacy of visual images. An experience that does become something that is completely attached. And so the assumption is that I see it, I distance myself from it, through the image, and that's enough for me. I can start to design things.
Well, my book is an argument against that.
Yeah.
But it's also an argument that the things that we admire are
there are these books now that are generated of digital reconstructions of all of Corbusier's buildings, which I think are completely worthless. They don't tell you anything about the building. I mean, you should be able to read a floor plan well enough to understand the building better than a digital, sort of one of these fancy digital reconstructions, because of course they're all looking at the outside. And I think you have to have a kind of ideal to work towards. And one of the things that's inspiring me is that the architects spoke very clearly that what really matters is the experience, and that experience doesn't cost anything. And John Dewey said experience doesn't require special training, or else we'd all be sunk. Basically, it's a part of daily life. And when we forget and we circle our work around other things besides that experience, because I quoted several of the architects as also saying that the best building is the building that gets the most benefit in terms of internal experience with the least effort and the least investment. Or as my friend Brian Mackey-Lyons in Nova Scotia says, the vernacular is what you do when you cannot afford to make a mistake, because it will be the end of your life, the end of your farm, the end of your, you cannot afford to experiment. So the vernacular is what you do when it's close to the bone, which is actually what all this work is. It's quite close to the bone. Now, not all of them. I wouldn't say the Farnsworth house is very close to the bone, but
Close to the bone is an American vernacular language. So how would you kind of interpret that as something that we can actually understand differently? You mean close to the bone, meaning something that's something that's
I don't think in this day and age, with the problems we are facing and with the energy crisis that Europe is facing now, that America is a little bit cushioned from, we have no business building anything that wastes anything. And so, but you have to balance it. What is it you're doing? You're going to do the most, you can just do a box and put people in a box? I would ask the students who are here, how much time did you spend out in front of the building today when you came into the building, looking at the beautiful front of the building, which is a nice building? And how much time did you sit in here? And how much time did you sit in other classrooms? And was it good? I tell my students, you can learn more from poor buildings than from great buildings, because you're not going to have the privilege of visiting that many great buildings. I've had a great privilege of visiting all the buildings I'm showing you, but you can't build a career out of just visiting these great buildings and then thinking, oh, well, I can make one of those too, maybe, if I got the right client. But the fact is that we learn from critiquing every space we're in, understanding the sort of proportions of the space. What is it about the space that doesn't quite feel right? Why is it not comfortable? Why is it comfortable? Why do I like being in this corner of this room? And this is the kind of thing that Bachelard, right, his whole book is basically about just open your eyes and pay attention to your reactions to space. What's comfortable, what's not comfortable. Crawling into a corner. I don't see so many corners that are inviting me in this room, but you know, this is a very sort of primitive impulse that should be part of a building. Hershberger told me that he grew up in Montessori. He was trained Montessori all his whole life, and that the best school that he ever had was an old house that, because they hadn't finished the new building, they converted an old mansion into a house, and it had a dumbwaiter, and the kids would get inside the dumbwaiter. You know what a dumbwaiter is? It's this thing that you carry food up and down from the kitchen, but people aren't supposed to be in it. But the kids were going up and down the dumbwaiter. They were hiding in the window seats. That basically it had hundreds of places for kids to disappear into and just work on their own, which is what Montessori is about, is self-motivated work. So, you know, but it was designed as a house, and then it was converted. So it leads to Hershberger's articulation that what we should do is design great space. The program may change, but if your building is so closely tied to a particular program, then when that program changes, your building is finished. And we can't afford to do this anymore. We can't afford to tear things down and build new things. We have to work with what we have and add to it, change it, modify it. But that means the space we have has to be really good, because we might want to use it for other things. My friend Wil Arets, the Dutch architect, he built every office building has 10-foot ceilings because he says it could be a house someday. So we have to build it so that it breathes and that it has 10-foot ceilings, it has proper light, and it has proper depth for housing. Because it may not, maybe we don't need offices in the future. That was said a few years ago before COVID. So, but we have to be thinking like that, because every building we build has to really outlast us and outlast the program. And it can't unless the space appeals to us in a more fundamental way. It invites us in. This idea of Van Eyck's homecoming, that it provides a homecoming so that people can use it for whatever they feel like using it for, if its first function ceases to matter. So.
And this reminds me of Roberta McCarterja, actually an essay. I don't know if you're familiar with interiors of second order and how architecture lost something when with modernism it just kind of lost the thickness and the envelope became so thin. So I'm wondering where you stand personally, because I feel that architects somehow divide on those who design from inside out or outside in, those who somehow believe in total creative design, or the ones who are more like Judd kind of open space creation, and those who enjoy more transparency and thickness.
Thick wall concept, that the real important spaces of the building are actually between the inside and the outside. And if you look at many of their buildings, sometimes it's in the section, sometimes it's in the plan. But I'm not a fan of flexible space. I think that's a serious mistake. I think there is no such thing as flexible space. Flexible space is no space. Flexible space is a room that nobody knows how to use. Flexible space is wasted space. I think you have to think about a space that calls for inhabitation. But it doesn't have to be determined what that inhabitation is. That's for the clients. The early housing of Hershberger is fantastic because he just built these kind of complicated interlocking spaces, and then people just put furniture wherever they wanted to, and they decided this is going to be the bedroom, this is going to be the living room, and the kitchen is at the center core, and everybody, every single one of the houses are different because people decided that wasn't the way they wanted to live was different than what their neighbor was doing. But it's the same space because the space has a certain kind of strength, and you can sort of think I could inhabit that as a bedroom. I could inhabit this as a library or whatever it is that you need. And I think the ability to make plans that have good space and a good sense of connection in the plan is super important. When I first moved to St. Louis, I looked at 77 houses old. I insisted they had type of family possibly, but whole neighborhoods in St. Louis have different sizes of houses because they knew different sort of economic groups would want to live in the neighborhood together. So they have really small houses and you have really big houses. Mine's kind of in the neighborhood together. So they have really small houses and you have really big houses. Mine's kind of in the middle. But I think personally, I think thickness is really important. The Montessori school that my students are doing, it has a room called a piazza, which is actually a term of Maria Montessori's. That's a room that the children, it's an interior space, but it operates like a piazza in a city. And the children can move from one classroom to another and kind of understand the way the school works. Because Montessori is about self-teaching and you move yourself through the school. You do not graduate from one grade to another. You decide you're ready to move to the next level because you've been able to do what's to be accomplished in the classroom that you're in. But the wall between the classroom and the piazza, it's a huge thick wall that's where the real action is. Because you don't want to be necessarily in the classroom, you don't want to necessarily be in the piazza, you're somewhere in the middle. And so I think that principle can work quite well. And I think sort of thin spaces are always in danger. I mean, unless they're built in the tropics. They don't breathe. They don't provide you, like David Leatherborough talks about layers of, you need to have houses that are like clothes that you can take off and put on, and you can open and close things so that you can get more or less air, more or less warmth, more or less cool, depending on the change of season. And we've kind of lost that because we sort of think we just push the button and that takes care of this problem. So, but the problem is now taking care of us. So I think thickness is also very good at that. Environmental tempering is one of the things that thickness, Kahn's idea of double roof, sun roof, rain roof. So you block the sun and then you just have to keep the rain out and the heat never gets into the building. The Angola embassy that was never built. But it was he learned it from looking at the local buildings. They all have the same concept. He just made it maybe more modern, but we just need to, well, it's not my battery, but anyway. We'll just close that. So we just need to learn to look long and hard. If I don't teach my students anything else, just look at the spaces you're in, look at the spaces you visit, look really hard, make sketches, make judgments. Right? Because in the end, you have to somehow empathize with the people who will be in the building, and you don't always know them, you don't always get to meet them, because that's not the way the profession works. Because I don't think, well, I don't know. None of my friends are making their living off of single-family houses for particular clients. So, we do them. I've done a few, and luckily the clients are still my friends, and they still live in the house. So, and I still have the key to the house. So, they must like me enough. Anyway, thank you for your patience. I don't know that if there's any more questions, but I will be here tomorrow, somewhere around the school for part of the day at least, in the morning. So if we run into each other, is Peter still here? I have a student who has come here from Washington University. Anyway, he's visiting Ljubljana for the first time, right? Yep. So I'm embarrassing him, but it's all right. Yeah. So thank you very much. Thank you.